Hi everybody, this is Joy Colley, and today we're going to take a look at Chapter 14. Chapter 14 is dealing with the brain and the oh-so-exciting cranial nerves. As always, we want to know what's the brain, what's any structure in the body do for you. And the brain is the majority of the nervous system in the body, and it has some very important functions. It's going to sense, process, and command. Essentially, it senses the environment, processes that information, decides sort of what's important, what's not important, and then it's going to send commands out to the body in order to respond to those particular issues that are coming up, to sense, process, and command. Pound and a half or so of the brain. It's a very important structure, so we have to protect the brain. There are several types of protection for your squishy brain. We see the cranial bones, the bones of your skull. These provide hard, crunchy armor plates for the bone. Your brain is bathed in a surrounding fluid, that's CSF. CSF is the appropriate abbreviation for cerebrospinal fluid. The cerebro in cerebrospinal fluid is the brain, and the spinal, of course, is the spinal cord. We see this same sort of pillowy, watery cushion surrounding both the brain and the spinal cord. In addition, we have a series of membranes. These are three relatively thin membranes that surround the brain. They are referred to as the mater. I'm saying that very specifically. There's one T in the word, mater. If it were two T's, we'd see matter. Like, how does it matter? What does it matter? This is the meningeal membranes. There are three of them. The dura mater, the arachnoid mater, and then for the notes we have the pia mater. And those are in the order that they appear. Outermost is the dura, and the innermost is the pia mater. Here's a nice picture of a human brain with the dura mater removed. So you see it's a very contoured membrane to the surface. All right, in addition, when we talk about protection, we also have a physiological protection known as the blood-brain barrier. And the concept here is that the neural tissue, the neurons, the cells that conduct electricity are extremely sensitive. So when they get any sort of change in their environment, any sort of chemicals that they might come in contact with from the blood, they're going to kind of freak out a little bit. So they might fire off when they shouldn't be firing off because they're extremely sensitive. So we have to protect the neurons, the firing mechanism of the brain, and we do that with the blood-brain barrier. And the blood-brain barrier is going to decrease the permeability of the capillaries within the brain. Now, permeability means what gets in and out of the blood vessels. So we're going to kind of lock down the blood vessels so that the brain tissue gets the stuff that it needs, oxygen, nutrients, hormones, but we're going to block it from any variation that might be going on within the bloodstream. So it just decreases what the brain cells have access to. And your textbook has a little bit of a description, and you got some information in the notes, but the whole concept is the neurons are very sensitive, so we're going to protect them from all kinds of debris and things that might be circulating in the blood. Blood-brain barrier. Now we talk about the CSF. Remember that central that cerebrospinal fluid. It's going to surround the brain, and it also is going to fill what we call the ventricles. It turns out the brain is not a solid structure. There are some spaces, there are fluid-filled spaces within the brain. Those are known as the ventricles. And we see a nice version here. And in the picture on the right-hand side of the screen, we're going to often talk about the chicken head. And what I want you to see here is there's a little eyeball of a chicken, and then a little chicken beak, and a sort of a crest of the chicken head, and that makes up what we call the third ventricle, and that's one of the spaces that's filled with cerebrospinal fluid. The cerebrospinal fluid is produced in a couple of different locations in the brain. So when we look at this in the lab, we're going to be locating two areas of the choroid plexus. Now, primarily the largest patch, the choroid plexus is essentially an area or a zone of cells. The largest area is in the third ventricle. Once again, that's associated with our chicken head. CSF is constantly being circulated. Your textbook has some nice diagrams. It's moving, it's flowing. It's flowing around the brain and spinal cord, it's flowing through the ventricles, and it's flowing up and down the central canal within the spinal cord. You don't need to worry about the exact pathway, but you recognize that the CSF is being circulated. All right, we're interested in the brain, the structures of the brain, the anatomy of the brain. I lovingly refer to this as the brain bits. The bulk of the brain, what makes brain look like brain, the very wrinkly component, is the cerebrum. And your textbook refers to it as the bulk, the majority of the brain tissue. And it's responsible for what we call primary brain activity. Primary brain activity is everything that makes you, you. So that involves your personality, what you like, what you don't like, what you find amusing, your thought process, whether or not you love biology, hate biology, think this chapter is boring. All of those things are associated with the action and the electricity going on in your cerebrum. So this is the primary component of your brain, not only in terms of anatomy, because it's the biggest portion, the biggest chunk, but also in terms of the activity. So we get a little bit more information about the cerebrum since it's so important. There are two major regions, two major hemispheres. Hemi just means half. So the brain is a left and a right hemisphere, and it's separated by what we consider a deep groove is a fissure. There's a fissure that separates. This is looking down on the brain. We see the very wrinkly cerebrum, and there's a deep, deep groove that separates the two halves, the two hemispheres. And the interesting thing about the wires, the electrical wires in the body, this is true throughout the body, including the brain, is that the wires crisscross. So what that means is everything on the left cerebral hemisphere is ultimately going to control what's going on the right-hand side of the body, and vice versa. The right cerebral hemisphere controls things on the left-hand side of the body. This is important for things like stroke. If a patient has an issue with their right-hand side, perhaps Bell palsy of the right-hand side of the face, or they can't use their right arm, that indicates that a stroke has occurred in the left cerebral hemisphere. All right, we also see some characteristics associated with brain patterns, what the left and right hemisphere are processing, and it's not always the same. We call this, and this topic's a little bit controversial, but your textbook refers to hemispheric lateralization. And that just refers to the fact that the left side does different things than the right-hand side. The left side has classically been associated with language, analytical tasks, and logic, meaning when you're processing language, when you're learning a new language, the left-hand side of your brain is what is firing. And the right-hand side has classically been associated with more artistic interpretation, more spatial visualizations. So you hear people talking about whether they are left-brained, meaning sort of very logical and analytical, or whether they are right-brained, more of an artist at heart. And that has to do not with the heart, of course, but with the brain. The cerebrum, we look at the cerebrum and it looks very texturally like brain, and that's because of the outer tissue. Outer tissue in anatomy is always referred to the cortex. So here we have the cerebral, just referring to the cerebrum, cerebral cortex. That's the thin outer layer of tissue, and it's what makes the wrinkly portion of the brain. Very classic. Looks like a brain. And those wrinkles are composed of two fundamental things. You have the grooves in the surface of the brain, sort of the low spots, and then you have the high spots between the grooves. Sometimes we refer to those as convolutions, but they're the puffy part of the brain. And there's a specific name, there's a special name for everything. There's a special name for the high spots and the low spots. The low spots, or the grooves, are known as the sulci. Sulci with an I. Those are the grooves in the brain. That's plural. That means more of them. Sometimes you'll see sulcus, which is just instead of an I on the end, you'll see a US on the end of that word. And that just means singular, one particular groove. And then the convolutions, the ridges, the high spots, the puffy parts are the gyri. Gyri, once again, that's plural. Gyrus with a US on the end just refers to a single puffy, pillowy convolution. Sulci and gyri, high and low spots, are ultimately what make the brain give it its wrinkled texture. And the idea here is to increase the surface area. The more wrinkles you have, the more high and low spots you have, the more surface area of the brain. And it's the cerebral cortex that we're looking at, the very, very surface. The more cortex, the more processing power. We want to increase that surface area with those convolutions. The cerebrum itself is set into what we consider 4 lobes. The good news about the lobes is they're named exactly for the bones that protect them. Same spelling, same location. So we have this nice color diagram. You have a similar one in your textbook where we're looking at the regions of the cerebrum. Frontal lobe, covered by and protected by the frontal bone, is responsible for conscious thought, and it's your primary motor sensory. Now, conscious thought is anything you are aware of thinking, I'm hungry, he's cute, what's for lunch, when is this lecture going to be over? Those are all responsibilities of the frontal lobe. The parietal lobe, the very top, yellow in this particular diagram, is primarily associated with taste and touch interpretation, and it's considered your primary sensory or somatosensory area. Temporal lobe on the side there, nice and pink, is auditory, that's bringing in information associated with sound, and olfactory, that's bringing information associated with taste and your tongue. And then at the very, very back, we have the occipital lobe. Occipital lobe is responsible for visual. In fact, the optic nerves, those are the wires that come off the back of your eyes. They're going to crisscross underneath the brain on the way to the occipital lobe. And very commonly, we find those crisscrossing optic nerves when we're playing with the brain in the laboratory. All right, what makes the human brain unique is our ability to process speech. We have a language. Now, you can argue that other animals know certain vocabulary. For instance, a dog might know, 20 or 30 words. They know their name, they know commands, they know the word treat or biscuit, but they don't really, and they bark at each other. Animals growl at each other. There's definitely birds chirp. There's definitely some communication, but what makes the human brain extremely unique from other animals is the very complicated language centers of the brain. And there are two specific regions, sort of patches on the cerebral cortex that are associated with speech. Both of these are going to be named for individuals. So you see kind of this capital letter activity associated with Broca's area. Broca's area is the zone or the patch of the cerebral cortex that's responsible for mechanically producing words. So as I am talking to you now, I'm using my airway, my larynx, my tongue, my lips to physically create words, and what's going to be lighting up in my brain is Broca's area. You, as you listen to these words, you're interpreting what those words mean, you're interpreting the sound as language. You're using Wernicke's area or Wernicke's area. This is a German individual, so the W sounds like a V. I've heard it pronounced a lot of different ways. Wernicke, Wernicke's, Wernicke, Wernicke's. Those are all saying the same thing. They're the patch of the brain associated with interpreting, listening to, and knowing the words. Broca's and Wernicke's. Right, in addition to the cerebrum, we also have the brain stem that's located beneath the hemisphere, so inferior to the wrinkly portion of the brain. There are a couple specific regions of the brain stem that we're interested in. Those regions are the pons. Pons literally translates to mean bridge, and that's a relay station primarily, and it also provides some assistance for the respiratory process. Now, when we say relay, we mean it's relaying information, meaning information comes in from the skin. That's touch. That needs to go to the parietal lobe. So the pons says, oh, that's touch. I'm going to send it. I'm going to relay it to the parietal lobe. Oh, that's information about sound. I'm going to relay, I'm going to send, I'm going to transfer that information to the temporal lobe. And then it plays a backup in respiratory to what we call the medulla oblongata. And this is a classic biological term, the medulla oblongata. Medulla provides vital controls. Vital controls are anything that you cannot survive without. So it's moment by moment survival. So that's circulation, bringing oxygen and to the body cells, and respiration, bringing oxygen into the body. And when we look at these structures in the brainstem, the pons is often referred to as an almond shape. Not quite sure where that came from, but that's appropriate. And then the medulla oblongata, that's what's going to extend out of your head and connect with the spinal cord, become the spinal cord when you get into the vertebra. So we see pons and medulla oblongata, those are the brainstem. And then located below and behind the hemispheres, so we're talking inferior and posterior to the wrinkly cerebrum, is the cerebellum. The cerebellum sort of tucked up under the back of the brain. And we talk about its control of muscle coordination. Now, that's sort of an overall view, but when we think about any particular voluntary action, so raising your arm, all you think about in your brain is, hey, I'd like to raise my arm and wave to my friend. But someone in the brain, and that's ultimately going to be the cerebellum, has to decide which muscles are acting towards that. So we just think raise your hand, but the cerebellum has to coordinate, the deltoid muscle, and the deltoid muscle has to contract 37.2%, and then the biceps brachii muscle has to contract, 62.9% simultaneously, the brachialis muscle. Someone has to decide and send specific signals to specific muscles to get a nice smooth voluntary skeletal action. And that's the role of the cerebellum. All right, we also have located in the very middle, we call it the core position. Think about an apple core kind of in the very middle. It's what we call the diencephalon. Di means two because there are two component parts to the diencephalon. Those two component parts are the thalamus. Watch how you spell this, thalamus. It's a filter and a relay station. So similar to what we were talking about the pons, it's going to relay information throughout the brain. And then the hypothalamus. Hypo gives us a little bit of a sense of where it's located. It's located below, actually below and in front of the thalamus. These are your drive controls. We think about your fundamental core instinctual drive. Thirst, hunger, sex drive, those are all controlled by the hypothalamus. It also helps us maintain homeostasis and temperature in the brain. When we think about that chicken head that we mentioned earlier, the chicken head itself is surrounded by cerebrospinal fluid, but it's fundamentally composed of the area located near the thalamus, that's the head and the eyeball of the chicken, and the hypothalamus, that's the beak of the chicken. The hypothalamus, by the way, sort of points, angles, and like a little triangle towards the pituitary gland. That's going to help us in the lab. All right, then the final component, the final brain bit, is the limbic system. The limbic system is often referred to as the motivational center, and the limbic system within the brain is a series of connected neurons, and it does several things for us. The three primary things that it does for us are to establish emotional state. So your limbic system decides sort of what mood you're in. It also links conscious and unconscious. There's a part of the brain that as you're going to sleep and as you're waking up is that fundamental connection between conscious states, and that's going to be the role of the limbic system. And then finally, for the notes, it also provides memory storage and access. When you learn a new fact, when you learn a new bit of information, it's the limbic system's job to decide where are we going to put that particular tidbit of knowledge. And then when it comes to trying to access it, trying to get that information, it's quiz time, it's test time, we need to know these biological terms. It's your limbic system that's going to go, now where did I put that information? So it's the limbic system that's going to function in recall or accessing particular information. All right, and the last part of this chapter is dealing with the cranial nerves. The cranial nerves, cranial refers to the head. First of all, there are 12 pairs of cranial nerves. They are peripheral nervous system components. They are going to be within the skull. They touch the brain. They connect to the brain, but they are not technically considered part of the brain. So they're not central nervous system. They connect to the brain, so they are peripheral nervous system. Very commonly, I'll ask you, hey, cranial nerves, are they CNS or PNS? The cranial nerves are peripheral nervous system. They're always going to be associated and identified by their Roman numerals. So the very, very first thing you need to do is learn your Roman numerals 1 through 12 if you're not familiar with those already. These are pairs. You have a right and a left of each of these, a right and a left cranial nerve pair 1, olfactory, a right and a left cranial nerve pair 2, optic, etc. Now, you're going to be responsible for knowing these are always the same numbers. So olfactory is always number 1, glossopharyngeal is always number 9. So you need to be able to identify the cranial nerves by number. And then ultimately, cranial nerves are going to be described as either sensory in function, sensory afferent, motor, efferent in function exclusively, or they could be both. They could be mixed nerves, a little bit of incoming, a little bit of outgoing, a little bit of sensory, a little bit of motor. So we have some mnemonics, some things to help us determine the order of the cranial nerves and whether or not they're motor, sensory, or both. This is just a view, the bottom of the brain. CN for cranial nerve. All of the yellow represent the cranial nerve. You're not going to be identifying these in the lab, but you recognize that they're plugged in. They connect specifically to the brain. And they're paired right and left. Okay, cranial nerves. The first mnemonic, this is the one I learned personally. O, to touch and feel, very good velvet. And the idea is the first letter is the first letter in the cranial nerves in order. So the first O in O is olfactory. The second O in O is optic. O, to touch and feel, very good velvet. So the V in velvet would be vagus. There are a couple of these. Your textbook also introduces once one takes the anatomy final, very good vacations are heavenly. The H in heavenly, because it's the 12th word in the mnemonic, would be the 12th cranial nerve. H for hypoglossal. Velvet. Then we need to know the function, whether they are sensory, motor, or both. So there's another mnemonic to help us, another little saying. S for sensory, M for motor, B for both. Some say marry money, but my brother says big brains mean more. Some say marry money, but my brother says big brains mean more. If the word starts with an S, it's sensory, M, it's motor, B, it's both. O, to touch and feel, very good velvet. The first O, Roman numeral 1, is olfactory. Olfactory is sensory. Some say marry money. And these are going to provide chemoreceptors to the olfactory bulbs. Olfactory bulb is all about your sense of smell. Optic nerve, we mentioned the optic nerves crisscrossing on their way to the occipital. This is sensory, carrying the information about light to the occipital lobe. Photoreceptors, the crisscrossing portion of the right to left and left to right optic nerves is called the chiasma. Chiasma just translates to mean cross, so it's where the optic nerves cross on the base of the brain. Those are cranial nerve pair number 2. 3 is oculomotor. Oculomotor, cranial nerve number 3. These are motor, kind of makes sense because that's in the name, that's helpful. And these are going to be associated with muscles in the eye. So we're going to be moving the rectus muscles of the eyeball. You do have some nice diagrams in your textbook, by the way, that sort of show you where these are located. You're not going to be locating them from a diagram. You're not going to be finding them other than a couple of them on the model. But I show them to you because your textbook walks you through. And you can see that these nerves, these sort of yellow wires, are going to some of the musculature that helps us position our eye. Oculomotor. 4 is the trochlear nerve pairs. Of course, you have a right and a left trochlear nerve. This is motor. And it's also involved with the muscles of the eye. So it's moving different specific muscles, but it's allowing you to position your eye and look at something. Trochlear. The trochlea, by the way, is the little pulley at the very top of this diagram. It's a physical structure that the muscle winds through. So it's called the trochlear nerve because it passes to the trochlea structure. All right. Cranial nerve 5, that's V, Roman numeral, is trigeminal. Trigeminal is both, sometimes both. Some say marry money, but, the B in but, both is also referred to as mixed. Trigeminal does 3 things. Tri means 3, so that makes sense. It's associated with sending information back and forth to the chewing muscles, to your forehead muscles, and to your lip muscles. And when you look at the trigeminal in the picture, you see 1, 2, 3 distinctive branches. We also have the abducens. It is motor, and it's going to be one of 3 specific cranial nerves associated with moving the eyes. So we have 12 cranial nerves total, and 4 of them, the optic nerve, which is sensory, and then there are 3 motor cranial nerves associated with moving your eye. That just should give you a sense of how important eyesight is to our interpretation of the environment. 4 total, 3 muscle, 1 sensory, 3 motor, 1 sensory, are dedicated to our sense of sight. All right, the facial nerve. This is a cranial nerve that is both. Facial gives you information, sensory, from the anterior tongue, so flavors associated with the very, very front part of your tongue. And then some of the muscles and the glands, like the salivary glands within your mouth, are going to be associated with the facial cranial nerve, number 7. Number 8 is vestibulocochlear. Both the vestibule and the cochlea are part of the inner ear. So the vestibulocochlear nerve is sensory, associated with bringing in sound from your ear. Cranial nerve 9, glossopharyngeal. Glosso, as a root word, translates to mean tongue. So the glossopharyngeal cranial nerves are bringing information to and from the tongue, specifically the posterior tongue, the back of the tongue, and the muscles associated with swallowing, and the very back salivary gland, parotid gland. All right, cranial nerve 10, that's an X in Roman numerals. It's vagus, baby. All right, spelled a little bit differently, but this is both. This is the only cranial nerve that leaves the head. It's going to go down and connect with your diaphragm, your breathing muscle. It's also going to branch to the viscera. Viscera is the general term for your guts, all the things, the contents in your abdominal organ. So it's the longest cranial nerve because it physically leaves the head, leaves the cranial cavity, and goes into the thoracic and abdominal cavity. There's your vagus nerve. Number 9 is your accessory nerve. Accessory is motor. Some say merry money, but my brother says big brains mean, the M in mean for motor. And this is all about muscles to the pharynx, larynx, neck, and back. And then your final cranial nerve is hypoglossal. Remember, glosso refers to your tongue. This is cranial nerve pair 12. It is motor. It's going to bring information to the action of the tongue. Hypoglossal. O, to touch and feel very good velvet. Ah, cranial nerves. And that's chapter 14. I appreciate your attention. Thank you.